11 days before my retention shares vested, and 9 days into an approved medical leave I had taken to sit with my husband through chemotherapy. The company I gave 26 years of my life to sent 2 contract security guards to my front door to collect a laptop. I handed it over on the porch. I signed their form. I thanked them because they were 2 guys making $22 an hour and none of it was their fault. Then I let that company sign a $1.4 billion merger without me. I let them announce it. I let them put out the press release with the photograph of everybody shaking hands under the banner. And then I picked up the phone and told the buyer why that deal could never legally close without my signature. You will not believe what our chief executive said to me in a hotel restaurant in December, when he still thought I was somebody he could manage. But the thing that has never once left me is what a 63-year-old manufacturing engineer named Bernie Ochoa kept in a spiral notebook in his toolbox for 19 years. Before I take you into it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I read them all. And if you have ever been the person who held an entire department together and then found out you were considered replaceable, hit like and subscribe to Revenge Lab. This one is for everybody who has ever called support. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I'm 57 years old. I started at Haverson Medical Systems in Dayton, Ohio, in March of 1999 as a documentation clerk at $11.40 an hour. I was 31, I had a 2-year-old, and I had a degree in medical technology that nobody in that building cared about. 26 years later, I was Vice President of Quality and Regulatory Affairs. I ran a department of 41 people. I signed the submissions that went to the Food and Drug Administration. My name was on the paperwork that let our devices be used on human beings in 11 countries. I want to be plain about something because it matters for everything that follows. I was very good at my job, not adequate, not a solid contributor, which is what my last performance review called me. I was the person you put in the room when the agency showed up unannounced, and in 26 years I never once lost an inspection. My husband, Marcus, is 60, and he has been the band director at Fairborn Middle School since 1993. In July, he was diagnosed with stage 2 esophageal cancer. Our daughter, Iris, is 26 and works nights in a surgical ICU in Denver. And Haverson Medical Systems makes an infusion pump called the Meridian 3, which sits on a pole next to a hospital bed and pushes medication into a person's vein at a rate measured in tenths of a milliliter an hour. Remember that pump. Everything in this story is that pump. The video call came at 8:52 on the morning of Friday, September 12th. I want you to have the room. Marcus was in the infusion chair, cycle 3, hour 2, with a heated blanket and the ugliest fleece hat you've ever seen because his hair had started going in patches, and he decided to get ahead of it. The chair next to him is a vinyl recliner, and I had my laptop bag under it. The meeting invite had come in at 8:47, 5 minutes notice. Title, Touch Base C, Whitfield W. Cole. Whitney Cole is our Chief People Officer. She is 41 and she was, I want to be fair, never anything but pleasant to me in 6 years. I stepped into the little hallway by the vending machines and took it on my phone. There were 2 squares on my screen. Whitney, in a home office with a ring light, and a man I did not recognize, camera off, name displayed as M. Prine, Employment Counsel. Whitney said, Claire, thanks so much for hopping on. How's Marcus? I said, he's in the chair right now, Whitney. There was a pause of about a second and a half. And then she read. I know she read because I could hear the specific flatness that comes into a person's voice when their eyes are tracking a document, and because 6 weeks later I got a copy of the script in Discovery. It's a Word file. It's called Talking Points, VP level, Riff Wave 2. DocX, and there are brackets in it where you insert the name. She said the company was undertaking a strategic realignment of the quality and regulatory function. She said my position was being eliminated. She said the decision was final and had been reviewed at the appropriate levels. She said my last day was that day. I said, Whitney, I'm on approved FMLA leave. I go back on the 29th. And she said, I understand, and this decision is completely unrelated to your leave status. I said, my retention shares vest on the 23rd. She said, I'd point you to your severance packet for all of that, which is going out to your personal email in the next few minutes. Then she said the sentence I have thought about probably 1,000 times since, and I want you to hear the exact wording, because it is a masterpiece of its kind. Claire, I want you to know that this is not a reflection of your contributions. Behind me, through the wall, I could hear the infusion pump in the bay beeping its end-of-bag alarm. 2 short, 1 long. I have heard that tone in my sleep for 20 years. That is a Meridian 3, our pump, in the ward where my husband was sitting. I said, who's taking regulatory? Whitney said that reporting structures were still being finalized. I said, Whitney, there's an open COPPA. There's an FDA response due on October 9th. Who is signing it? And the man with his camera off, M. Prine, Employment Counsel, spoke for the first and only time. He said, we're not going to get into operational specifics on this call. That's when I knew. Not when she said my position was eliminated. Not when she mentioned the shares. Right there, when a lawyer who had said nothing for 4 minutes came in fast to stop me from asking who was going to sign a document to the federal government. I said, understood, thank you both. I hung up. Then I went back into the infusion bay and sat down next to my husband and held his hand for 2 hours and 40 minutes and did not say one word about it, because the man was getting platinum chemotherapy dripped into his chest, and there was not one single thing he could do. That night, after he was asleep, I opened my personal email and read the severance packet. And on page 9, in section 6C, there was a paragraph that made me put the laptop down and walk out into my own backyard at 11 o'clock at night and stand there in the grass. Because they had asked me to swear to something no honest company would ever need. Let me back up 8 months, because you need to know what a COPPA is and why it broke everything. COPPA stands for Corrective and Preventive Action. In a medical device company, it is the single most important process there is. When something goes wrong with a product in the field, when a hospital calls and says a pump did something it should not have done, a complaint gets opened. Complaints get investigated. If the investigation shows a real problem, you open a COPPA, and a COPPA is a formal, documented, dated commitment to find the root cause and fix it. You cannot unopen a COPPA quietly. Every COPPA has a number. Every COPPA is in a system the FDA can walk in and read on any Tuesday it wants. That's the whole design of it. It's a paper trail that a company builds against itself on purpose, because the alternative is people dying. I opened COPPA 240117 on June 3rd of last year. Here is what it was about, in plain English. The Meridian 3 pushes medication through a plastic line. Sometimes that line gets partially blocked, a kink, a patient rolls over, a clot at the catheter tip. The pump senses the back pressure and alarms. That's normal, that's the design, that's every pump ever made. What our pump did, under one specific set of conditions, was different. If the occlusion cleared while the pump was in a particular state, a soft alarm that had been silenced by a nurse but not cleared, with a certain firmware revision, on a certain size cassette, the pump did not simply resume at the programmed rate. It delivered everything that had been building up behind the blockage, all at once, in under a second. We call that a post-occlusion bolus. In an engineering meeting, it sounds like a specification issue. In a hospital room, it means a patient on a hydromorphone drip receives roughly 90 minutes of narcotic in a single breath. I did not discover this. Bernie Ochoa did in 2019 on a bench with a graduated cylinder and a stopwatch, and he wrote it in a notebook, and he told his manager, and his manager escalated it, and it went into a design review, and it was closed as not reproducible under normal use conditions. What made me open COPPA 240117 in June of last year was a set of complaint files. 22 of them over 4 years from 11 different hospitals, and the narratives were nearly identical. Alarm silenced. Line cleared. Patient became unresponsive within 2 minutes. Naloxone administered. Code called. 19 of those patients died. I want to be careful here. 19 people died in hospitals where they were already very sick. Not one of those deaths had been attributed to our device by the reporting facility, because the facility didn't know what to look for. But I did, because I had read all 22 of them in one afternoon, side by side, which is a thing nobody had ever done, because the complaint system sorted them by product code and hospital, and never by narrative. So I opened the COPPA. I wrote the summary myself. I used the phrase potential systemic design deficiency with patient safety implications because that is what it was. That was June 3rd. On June 19th, Ford Bellamy, our chief financial officer, 52, a man who has never in his life raised his voice, asked me to come to a meeting on the 4th floor that was not on my calendar. Trevor Lang was there, our CEO, 46 years old, hired in 2019 out of a private equity portfolio company, and I want to describe him properly, because if I make him a cartoon, you will not understand how he did what he did. Trevor Lang was charming, genuinely, not slick warm. He remembered your kids' names, and he actually cared what the answer was. He came out onto the floor in a quarter zip and ate in the cafeteria and knew the second shift line leads by their first names. He also had, without exception, the ability to make you feel that any concern you raised was a timing problem rather than a substance problem. He said, "Claire, talk to me about 117. I talked to him about 117 for 11 minutes. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which is a thing very few executives can do, and when I was done, he leaned back and said, "Okay, so walk me through the recall math." And I said, "It's not recall math yet. It's root cause. I need engineering time and I need the field units back." And Ford Bellamy said, without looking up from his legal pad, "How many units?" I said, 11,400 in service. And Trevor Lang said, and this was the entire conversation, this one sentence, and everything in this story flows out of it. "Claire, help me understand the difference between a design deficiency and a use error. Because from where I sit, 22 events out of 11,000 pumps over 4 years is a training problem." 2 months later, we were in a signed exclusivity agreement with Kestrel Medical Group. And on September 21st, 9 days after they walked me out, somebody closed COPPA 240117. Reason code, not substantiated, no design change required. Signed by a senior manager of quality systems, 4 levels below me, who had been in the role for 6 weeks. Section 6C, page 9 of the severance agreement. I'm going to read it to you the way it was written. Employee represents and warrants that, as of the separation date, employee is not aware of any facts that would constitute a violation of any law, regulation, or company policy relating to product safety, regulatory reporting, or financial disclosure, and that employee has disclosed all such matters, if any, to the company in writing prior to the separation date. Read it again if you need to. I read it maybe 40 times that first night. Because a normal severance agreement asks you to release your claims. It asks you not to disparage. It asks you to return property and keep confidences. Those are all standard, and I had signed things like them before on behalf of people who worked for me. A normal severance agreement does not ask you to swear an oath that you don't know about any safety problems. You do not ask that question unless you are afraid of the answer. The number attached to that signature was $418,000. 12 months of base, a pro-rated bonus, 18 months of COBRA premiums paid. And this is the part that mattered: accelerated vesting of the retention award, which at the announced deal price was worth $1,106,000. $1.5 million, near enough. We had $31,000 in savings. Marcus had 11 more cycles of chemotherapy, and then surgery, and then radiation. Our out-of-pocket max was $9,200 a year, and we had already hit it, and it was going to reset in January. Iris had $81,000 in nursing school loans that we had promised to help with, and had not been able to. I had 21 days to sign. The Older Workers Benefit Protection Act gives you 21 days and then a 7-day revocation period, and every single one of those days I felt like a physical object sitting on my chest. Here's what I did with them. I did not call a lawyer on day 1. I did not post about it. I did not send the all-caps email to Trevor Lang that I wrote 4 times and deleted 4 times. I got a yellow legal pad, and I made a list, in my own handwriting, of every single document I had ever touched relating to COPPA 240117, and where each one lived and who else had a copy. Not to take them. I want to be extremely clear about that, and it is the single most important tactical decision I made in this entire story. I never took one document, not one file, not one screenshot, not one email forwarded to a personal account. Not on September 12th and not on any day after. Because I knew I had sat through the training I wrote, that the very first thing they would do, the second I became a problem, was accuse me of stealing confidential information. It is the oldest move there is. It turns a whistleblower into a defendant in about 9 days. So my list wasn't a copy, it was a map. 41 items, where each one lived. Who else had it? Which ones existed only inside the company's own validated systems, where they could not be deleted without leaving an audit trail, which, I want you to appreciate, is a control I had designed in 2016. I had built the vault, and then they had locked me out of it and forgotten that I knew exactly how many doors it had. On September 26th, I drove to a strip mall office in Kettering and put $400 on my credit card for an hour with an employment lawyer. Because that's all I could afford, and she was fine, and she told me my case was difficult but not hopeless, and that FMLA retaliation claims typically settle in the $50,000 to $150,000 range. I drove home and sat in the driveway, and I thought, $50,000 to $150,000. 19 people are dead, and the number is $50,000 to $150,000. That night, Marcus was up at 2 in the morning because the neuropathy in his feet had started, and he couldn't get comfortable, and I made him tea he didn't drink, and he looked at me across the kitchen island and said, "You've got your work face on. You've had it for 2 weeks." I told him everything. All of it at 2 in the morning, to a man on his 3rd cycle of chemotherapy, who weighed 141 pounds. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How many days do you have left to sign?" I said 14. And Marcus Whitfield, who has spent 33 years teaching 12-year-olds to play the trombone, and who has never made more than $68,000 in a year, said, "Don't sign it." I said, "Marcus, it's $1.5 million. And he said, "Claire, I'm not going to be the reason you swore to something that isn't true." I let the 21 days run out. October 3rd came and went. I did not sign. I did not counter. I did not call. And here is the thing I did not expect. Nothing happened. No follow-up. No just checking in. No pressure. On October 6th, Whitney Cole's assistant sent a 2-line email confirming that the offer had lapsed and that my Cobra election materials would come separately. That silence told me something enormous, and it took me 2 more weeks to understand what. They were not worried about me. They had walked a 57-year-old woman out of the building during her husband's cancer treatment, offered her $1.5 million to swear she didn't know anything, and when she declined, they had shrugged. Because what could I possibly do? I had no documents. I had no employer. I had a non-compete and a confidentiality agreement and a sick husband and $31,000. I was, from where they sat, a solved problem. On October 30th, at 6:01 in the morning, Havorson Medical Systems and Kestrel Medical Group announced a definitive merger agreement. $1.4 billion in cash. Kestrel is a $40 billion strategic acquirer with 16,000 employees and a hospital sales force in 30 countries. I watched the video of the announcement on my phone, standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe. There was a banner. There was a photograph. Trevor Lang and Kestrel's CEO shaking hands in front of the Meridian 3 production line, and behind them, out of focus, 40 or 50 employees in blue smocks applauding. Bernie Ochoa was in that photograph, 3rd from the left, not applauding. The stock, Havorson had been public since 2014, closed up 61% that day. Trevor Lang's equity, at the deal price, was worth $38 million. Ford Bellamy's was 11. Whitney Cole's was 4.2. And on November 4th, 4 days after the announcement, my old assistant Rhonda, who had worked for me for 9 years and who had been told not to contact me, called from her car in a major parking lot and cried for the first 6 minutes. Then she said, "Claire, they changed the severance plan." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The change of control plan. The one that gives everybody the enhanced package if we get bought. They amended it. There's a memo. It was dated in July." I said, "Amended it how?" And Rhonda said, "It used to be 12 months for anybody with 15 years or more. Now it's 4 weeks per year of service capped at 16 weeks, and it only applies if you're terminated within 90 days after closing instead of 18 months. I sat down on the stairs in my own house. 1,100 people worked at Havorson Medical Systems. 400 and some of them had been there 15 years or more. The plant floor is full of people in their 50s who came over from Delphi and NCR and Copeland and thought, this one's family-owned, this one's safe. The July amendment took, by my arithmetic on the back of an envelope that night, somewhere between $19 and $22 million out of those employees' pockets. Which is money that does not leave the deal. It just changes whose column it sits in. Rhonda said, "Nobody knows. It's in the 8K exhibit. Nobody reads the 8K exhibit." I said, "Rhonda, who signed the amendment?" And she said, "The compensation committee. 3 people." I said, "Which 3? And she told me, and the third name was the one that put a hole through the middle of my chest. Because the chair of the compensation committee of the board of directors of Havorson Medical Systems was Lorraine DeVers, 66 years old, who had been Gordon Havorson's business partner since 1987, who came to my wedding in 1996, and who wrote me a handwritten note in 2011 that said Gordon always said you were the best hire he ever made. I still have that note. It is in a drawer 9 feet from where I'm sitting. I asked Lorraine DeVers to lunch on November 12th, and she said yes, which surprised me, and she picked the place, which should have warned me. The Golden Lamb dining room, an hour away in Lebanon, where nobody from the company would be. She looked wonderful. She is 66 and she looks 58, and she wore a camel coat she did not take off. She asked about Marcus for 6 minutes and she meant it. Lorraine is not a fraud, which is what makes what she did so much worse. Then she said, "You didn't ask me here about Marcus." I said no. I laid it out, not accusatory. I told her about COPPA 240117 and the 22 complaints and the 19 deaths. I told her the COPPA had been closed by a manager 6 weeks into the role while I was on leave. I told her about Section 6C and what it had asked me to swear. And I told her about the July amendment to the change of control severance plan. She let me finish, then she folded her hands. And Lorraine DeVers said, "Claire, do you know what the alternative was?" I said, "To what?" She said, "To the deal. Do you know what the alternative to the deal was?" She had numbers. She always has numbers. She said Havorson had missed 4 consecutive quarters. She said the revolving credit facility had a covenant test in March that we were going to fail. She said that without Kestrel, there was a real scenario in which the company did a distressed sale to a financial buyer in 18 months, and that buyer closed the Dayton plant and moved production to Juarez, and 1,100 people lost everything instead of some people losing some things. She said the plan amendment was ugly. It was. It bought us 40 basis points on the purchase price, and it was the difference between Kestrel and no Kestrel. Then she said, "You've been in quality your whole career, and you have never once had to be the person who chooses which bad thing happens." And I said, "Lorraine, 19 people are dead." And she said, "This is the moment. This is where I lost her, and it happened so smoothly I almost didn't feel it." She said 19 people died. In hospitals, on hydromorphone, with comorbidities. You have a hypothesis about a mechanism, Claire. You do not have a finding because the COPPA closed unsubstantiated. I said, it closed unsubstantiated because they closed it. And Lorraine DeVers put her napkin on the table and said, "Then that's a matter for the FDA, and the FDA has inspected us 4 times and cleared us 4 times. And the last 3 of those, the person who walked them through the building was you." She paid the check. At the door, putting on gloves she'd never taken off her lap, she said the last thing she has ever said to me. "Claire, I'm going to say this because I do actually care about you. You are 57 years old, you have no job, no counsel, no documents, and a sick husband. Whatever you think you're going to do, you're not going to do it. Take a settlement. There's still one on the table if you ask nicely." She got in her car. I sat in mine in the parking lot of a 200-year-old inn for 20 minutes, and I want to tell you what I felt, and it was not rage. It was something much more useful. Because Lorraine Devers had just told me exactly what they thought my weaknesses were. She had listed them out loud, in order, like a woman reading a bid tab. No job, no counsel, no documents, sick husband. She was right about 3 of those. She was wrong about the 4th, and she was wrong about it because of something that had happened in a conference room in October of 2004, when Lorraine Devers was in Chicago and Gordon Havorson was signing a piece of paper that she never read. But I didn't know that yet either. What I knew, driving back up 75 that afternoon, was that I needed to stop thinking like an employee. And the first thing an employee never does is call the person who used to work under her and ask a question she's not supposed to ask. Bernie Ochoa has worked at Havorson since 1991. He is 63 years old, he is a senior manufacturing engineer, and he has never in 34 years been promoted into management, because he told me once that management is where they send you when they want you to stop being right. I did not call him. I did not email him. I went to the Kroger on Wilmington Pike at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, because Bernie Ochoa has bought his groceries at the same Kroger at the same hour every Saturday since his wife died in 2016, and everyone at that plant knows it. He saw me buy the coffee, and he did not look surprised. He said, "Took you 9 weeks." We sat in his truck in that parking lot for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I said, "Bernie, I'm not going to ask you for anything. I need you to know that up front. You've got 20 months to your pension multiplier, and I'm not going to put that at risk." And Bernie Ochoa said, "Claire, do you know why I never took a management job?" I said, "Because you'd have to stop being right." He said, "No, because if you're in management, everything you write down belongs to them." Then he reached into the console and took out a spiral notebook. Not a company notebook, not a controlled document. A 99-cent green spiral notebook from a drugstore, soft at the corners, with a rubber band around it, and there were 4 more like it at his house. He said, "I've kept one of these since 1997. It's my own time, my own pen, my own paper. Every time something happens on that floor that I think somebody's going to lie about later, I write it down at home that night. Date, time, who was there, what got said." He said, "My daddy worked at Frigidaire and he told me to do it." I said, "Bernie, that could be considered company confidential information." And he said, "It's my memory, Claire. They can't own my memory. I asked a lawyer in 2003. He opened it to a page he had already marked with a folded receipt. March 14, 2019. Bench 4. Bernie and a technician named Hollies. 12 trials on a Meridian 3, cassette size 250, firmware 4. 2. 1. Occlusion induced with a hemostat, alarm silenced but not cleared, occlusion released. In the 12 trials, the pump delivered an average of 3, 9 milliliters in under 1 second. At a programmed rate of 2, 6 milliliters an hour, that is 90 minutes of medication in one breath. Written under it, in ballpoint, in a machinist's block letters. Told Brenner, he said design review will handle. I do not think design review will handle. And on the facing page, dated June 27, 2019. Design review closed IT, not reproducible under normal use. I reproduced IT 12 times in a row on a Tuesday. I sat in that truck, holding a drugstore notebook. I said, "Bernie, why didn't you ever bring this to me?" And he said the thing that I will carry for the rest of my life. He said, "Claire, I brought it to your predecessor in 2019, and he told me to stay in my lane. And then you got the job in 2021, and I figured you were the same as him for about 2 years, and by the time I figured out you weren't, I was 59 years old with a pension and no wife, and I was scared." He looked out the windshield. He said, there's a lady in Springfield named Doreen Whatley whose mother died on our pump in 2022. I looked her up. I never called her. I've had her number in my phone for 3 years. Then he said, you gonna do something, or are you just collecting? And I said, Bernie, I'm going to need about 4 months, and I'm going to need you to keep doing your job exactly the way you always have, and to not tell one single person you talk to me. He said, that's fine. What's in 4 months? And I said, in 4 months they have to hold a shareholder vote. He put the notebook back in the console. He said, then I'll see you in 4 months. But before the vote, there was something I still didn't have, and it wasn't evidence. It was leverage. And I found it 11 days later, in a widow's basement, in a banker's box labeled in a dead man's handwriting. Dolores Havorson is 79 years old and lives in the same 4-bedroom house on Runnymede Road that she and Gordon bought in 1979. And she has not changed the kitchen, and she is not going to. Gordon Havorson founded the company in 1976 in a rented bay off Springboro Pike. He died in March of 2023 at 81 of a stroke, 11 days after his last board meeting. He hired me in 1999. He is the reason for every single thing in my life that has a dollar sign on it. I called Dolores on November 21st, and she said, well, it's about time, which is how she answers the phone. She made coffee, she asked about Marcus, she asked about Iris, and then she said, you want the boxes. I said, how did you know that? And Dolores Havorson said, because Lorraine DeVers came and asked for them in August, and I told her to go to hell. I said, Lorraine came here. She said, twice. Second time, she brought a young man with a briefcase who wanted to talk about consolidating the historical corporate record. She sipped her coffee. She said, Gordon kept everything, and I know exactly what's in every box, and I have never once let anybody in that basement, including my own son. But I'll tell you what I told her. Gordon's papers stay in Gordon's house. Then she looked at me over the cup and said, you, though, he'd have let you in. The basement had 31 bankers' boxes on steel shelving, labeled in Gordon's handwriting, which was small and slanted and absolutely legible, because he'd been a draftsman before he was anything. Board minutes 1976, 1989. Board minutes 1990, 1999. Patent files. Union negotiations 1994. Bank, Fifth Third. Bank, Provident. And on the third shelf, one box labeled 2004, the bad year. I want to tell you about 2004, because Dolores told me most of it upstairs, and Gordon had told me a version of it years before, and it is the hinge on which every single thing in this story turns. In 2004, Havorson Medical Systems nearly died. There was a recall, a real one, a legitimate one, on an old volumetric pump, and it cost $11 million, and the bank pulled the line of credit in October, and there was a Friday in November where there was not enough cash to run payroll for 340 people. Gordon put in his own money. Dolores put in her mother's money. Lorraine DeVers, who was then a partner and not yet a chair, put in $400,000. And a 36-year-old director of regulatory affairs named Claire Whitfield, who had been at the company 5 years, cashed out a $401k, took a home equity loan against a house she'd owned for 4 years, and put in $180,000. Everything I had, every dollar, at 36 with a 5-year-old. I have never talked about that publicly, and almost nobody at that company in 2025 knew it happened, because the people who were in the room are dead, retired, or Lorraine. I did it because Gordon Havorson sat on the edge of my desk on a Thursday afternoon and said, Claire, I'm not going to lie to you. If this doesn't work, you lose all of it. And because I was 36 and I believed in a building. I got the money back in 2009, with interest when the company refinanced. I always thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, because of something Gordon said when he handed me the paperwork in October of 2004, and I remembered it, standing in that basement, the way you remember a smell. He'd slid a folder across the desk and said, sign the bottom too. And Claire, hang on to your copy. Don't ever let them take that paper back. I thought he was being sentimental. He was 70 years old and had almost lost his life's work in a week. He was not being sentimental. I opened the box labeled 2004, the BAD year at 2:40 in the afternoon on November 21st, in a basement on Runnymede Road. And 40 minutes later, I was sitting on a concrete floor with a document in my hands and my ears ringing. It was in a manila folder marked in Gordon's hand. Preferred, 1004, do not destroy. There were 4 documents in it. The first was a subordinated promissory note, dated October 14, 2004, from Havorson Medical Systems to Claire E. Whitfield, in the principal amount of $180,000 at 9%. That's the note that got paid off in 2009. I remembered it. I'd framed the check stub for about a year and then put it in a drawer. The second was a stock purchase agreement. The third was a stock certificate, a real one engraved with a scalloped border, because in 2004, Gordon Havorson still used a printer in Cincinnati who made them the old way. 1-800 shares, Series A1 preferred stock, stated value 1.00 per share. $1,800 worth of stock, issued to me in 2004 as what the agreement called an equity inducement, on top of the note, because Gordon didn't want to just borrow money from a 36-year-old woman who'd emptied her retirement account. He wanted her to own something. $1,800 in a company that was about to be sold for $1.4 billion. It's a rounding error. It is less than a rounding error. It is not even a line item. And the fourth document was 11 pages long, and it was titled Certificate of Designation of the Powers, Preferences and Rights of Series, A1 Preferred Stock of Havorson Medical Systems, Inc. Filed with the Secretary of State of the State of Delaware, October 14, 2004. I read all 11 pages, sitting on the floor of that basement. Section 4 was called Protective Provisions, and I'm going to read you the opening of it, because I have it memorized now the way some people have scripture. So long as any shares of Series A1 preferred stock remain outstanding, the corporation shall not, either directly or indirectly, by amendment, merger, consolidation, recapitalization, reclassification, or otherwise, without the prior written consent of the holders of a majority of the then outstanding shares of Series A1 preferred stock, voting as a separate class, consummate any deemed liquidation event, including without limitation any merger or consolidation of the corporation with or into any other entity, or any sale, lease, transfer, or other disposition of all or substantially all of the assets of the corporation. There it was, 21 years old, 11 pages, filed in Dover, Delaware, on a Thursday in October 2004 for $189. The Havorson-Kestrel merger could not close without my written consent. Not my vote, my consent, in writing, voting as a separate class, and I was the entire class. I sat there for a long moment and made myself do the thing I do professionally, which is to try to find every reason a document doesn't mean what you want it to mean. I've killed 100 people's theories that way, including my own. Were the shares redeemed? The note was repaid in 2009. The shares were separate consideration, and there is no redemption provision in the certificate at all. Gordon's lawyer had drafted it without one, which in 2004 was a mistake, and in 2026 was a miracle. Did I sign them away later? I went through every employment agreement I'd ever signed with the company that night. Nothing. Were they wiped out in the 2011 recapitalization? That's what I was most afraid of. In 2011, the company did a full recap ahead of the IPO and amended and restated the charter completely. I found the restated charter online, in the exhibits to the 2014 registration statement, at 1:40 in the morning, and I read it in a kitchen with my husband asleep upstairs. Article 4th, Section 3, Paragraph C. The Series A1 preferred stock shall remain outstanding in accordance with its terms. The rights, preferences, privileges, and restrictions of which are set forth in that certain certificate of designation, filed with the Secretary of State of the State of Delaware on October 14, 2004, which is hereby ratified, confirmed and continued in full force and effect. A 2011 corporate lawyer, faced with a weird little $1,800 series held by one employee, had done the easiest thing available to him, which is what corporate lawyers do at 11 p.m. on a closing. He had carried it forward by reference. And nobody, not Lorraine Devers, not Trevor Lang, not Ford Bellamy, not the $600 an hour deal team at the firm in Chicago that papered a $1.4 billion merger, had ever pulled the underlying document from 2004. But that isn't even the part that made me put my hand flat on the kitchen table. That was Section 6. Section 6 was called Information and Inspection Rights, and it said that so long as any share of Series A1 remained outstanding, the holder was entitled, upon 5 business days' written notice, to inspect and copy the books, records, and accounts of the corporation. And then it listed them, because Gordon Haverson had lived through a recall in 2004 and had told his lawyer exactly what he wanted a nervous investor to be able to see, including without limitation minutes of the board and its committees, financial records, and all files relating to product complaints, corrective and preventive actions, and correspondence with the United States Food and Drug Administration. I had refused, for 2 months, to take a single document out of that building. And it turned out that since October of 2004, I had owned the legal right to demand every one of them. I need to tell you about the 10 days after that because they were not triumphant. They were the most careful 10 days of my life. Because here is what a smart, well-funded, terrified company does when it learns that a fired executive holds a blocking right on its merger. It does not negotiate. It goes to the Delaware Court of Chancery and files a declaratory judgment action arguing that the series was constructively redeemed or abandoned, or that the holder waived her rights by accepting the note repayment in 2009, or that the 2011 ratification was a scrivener's error, or all 4 at once. It hires the best law firm in the country, and it does it before you've filed anything, so it picks the forum and the framing, and you spend 6 months as a defendant. If I made one wrong move, if I called Trevor Lang and gloated, if I told a single person who might tell a single person, I would have handed them a head start. So I got a real lawyer. Adele Ferrero is 58, practices out of a 2-partner shop in Cincinnati, and spent 19 years at a large firm doing Delaware corporate litigation before she left to take care of her mother and never went back. I could not afford her. I want to be honest about that. Her retainer was $40,000, and I had $31,000 in the world and a husband who needed surgery in February. I drove down on November 24th with the folder in a canvas bag on the passenger seat like it was an organ in a cooler. She read the certificate of designation twice, front to back, without saying anything. Then she read the 2011 restated charter. Then she pulled up the Delaware Division of Corporations database on her own screen and ordered certified copies of every filing in the company's history for $84. Then she took her glasses off and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, how many people know this exists?" I said, "Me, and Dolores Haverson, who does not know what it says." She said, "Keep it that way." The certified copies came back on December 2nd. 9 filings since 1976, 22 amendments, not one certificate of elimination, not one amendment touching Series A1 except the 2011 ratification that made it stronger. Adele Ferrero looked at the stack on her desk and said, "So they've been representing to Kestrel, in a signed merger agreement, that they've obtained all requisite stockholder approvals." I said, "Have they?" She said, "They've got the common vote lined up. The board has 31% and the institutions will follow. But there is one class of stock in this company that votes separately, and its entire class is a woman they fired by video call during her husband's chemotherapy." She put her hands flat on the desk. She said, "Claire, I want you to understand the size of what you're holding because I don't think you do yet. There is a closing date in a merger agreement. There is a financing commitment behind it with an outside date. There is an $11 million reverse termination fee. There are 2,000 pages of representations and warranties, and one of them, Section 3. 4, it's always Section 3. 4 says the company has full corporate power to enter into this agreement, and no consent of any other person is required. She said that representation is false. It has been false since October 30th. Then she said, I'll take a contingency. I said, what? She said, 20%, and I front the costs. My mother was on a Meridian 3 in 2021. She stood up and put out her hand. She said, now let's talk about what you actually want, because if you tell me the answer is money, I'm going to be disappointed in you and I'm still going to do a very good job. I said, I want the recall. She said, that's not a legal outcome. That's an FDA outcome. And I said, Adele, I have inspection rights. Section 6. I want the complaint files, the copper record, and every email in that building with the words complaint coding in them, and I want them produced to me legally, on company letterhead, with a cover memo by their own lawyers. Adele Ferrero sat back down slowly. She said, oh, that's good. She served the Section 6 inspection demand on December 8th, by certified mail and by email, to the corporate secretary of Havorson Medical Systems. It was 2 pages. It did not mention the merger. It did not mention the blocking right. It demanded, as the holder of the outstanding series a 1 preferred stock, inspection of a defined list of records. She wanted to see what they'd do. What they did told us everything. They ignored it for 9 days. And then, on December 17th, Trevor Lang personally texted my cell phone, a number he had never once used in 6 years, and asked if I would have dinner. Before I take you to that dinner, I have to tell you about Sunny Reyes, because she came to me first, and because she is the bravest person in this story, and she was 34 years old and made $61,000 a year. Sunny worked in complaint intake. That's the front door. When a hospital calls or emails or files through the portal, a human being reads it and codes it, and the code determines everything that happens next, whether it goes to investigation, whether it becomes a medical device report to the FDA, whether anybody ever looks at it again. She emailed my personal address on December 5th. Subject line, you probably don't remember me. I remembered her. She'd asked a question in a training session in 2023 that was better than the training. We met at a Panera in Beaver Creek at 7:30 in the morning because she worked 7 to 3:30. She had a folder and she was shaking. She said, I don't know if I'm allowed to be here. I said, you're allowed to be anywhere you want on your own time. Sunny, before you show me anything, did you take company documents? She said they're screenshots from my work computer to my phone. And I said, okay, put the folder away. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. I said, Sunny, listen to me carefully because I need you protected. If you hand me those, they'll say I induced you to steal, and they will end your career and they will never have to talk about what's in them. Put it away. Then I said, now tell me in your own words what you saw. Nobody owns your memory. She told me. In May of last year, 3 weeks before I opened COPPA 240117, which I did not know at the time, complaint intake received a new procedure. It was called the Complaint Coding Harmonization Initiative. It came from the Senior Director of Quality Systems, and it was, on its face, entirely reasonable. It was a set of decision tree criteria intended to reduce inconsistent coding across the intake team. Here is what it actually did. Under the old criteria, a complaint narrative that described an unexpected medication delivery got coded device malfunction, delivery accuracy, which is a code that triggers investigation, and if there's a death or serious injury, a mandatory report to the FDA within 30 days. Under the new decision tree, if the narrative contained certain phrases, alarm silenced, alarm not cleared, line manipulated by clinician, pump repositioned, the complaint routed to use error, no device failure identified, which triggers nothing, which files it, which makes it disappear. And every single one of those phrases describes the exact condition under which our pump dumped a bolus. They didn't hide the complaints. That's what's so elegant about it, and that's why it went unnoticed for 11 months. They kept every one of them. They coded them into a bucket where nobody would ever put them side by side. Sunny said I coded 4 of them that way. I knew, I asked. I said, who did you ask? She said, my supervisor. She said, follow the tree. So I emailed the senior director and asked if we should flag the harmonization change to quality leadership. I said, what did he say? And Sonny Reyes said, he said, Claire Whitfield is aware of the initiative. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me in a Panera at 7:40 in the morning. Because I was not aware. I have never in my life seen that document. And in a Form 483 observation, or in front of a grand jury, or in a deposition, the sentence Claire Whitfield is aware of the initiative makes me the person who approved it. They hadn't just fired me. They had been building a place to put the blame for 11 months before they fired me, and I had been sitting 3 floors up signing FDA submissions and not knowing. I said, Sonny, do not delete anything. Do not clean up your mailbox. Do not do the thing where you get scared and tidy. Everything you have on that system, leave it exactly where it is. She said, why? And I said, because in about 6 weeks, somebody with a badge is going to ask for it, and I want it to be theirs to produce, not yours to hand over. She said, am I going to lose my job? I said, probably. She sat with that. Then she said, okay. And then Sonny Reyes said, my grandmother was on a morphine pump at Miami Valley in 2023. I coded a complaint from that floor 8 months later. I called my daughter on December 9th. Iris works 3/12s on nights in a surgical ICU in Denver. She is 26, and she is better at her job than I was at hers at that age. And we talk on Sunday mornings while she's decompressing and I'm making coffee. I hadn't told her any of it. Not the firing, not really. I'd said restructuring in October and let her think it was ordinary. That Sunday, I told her about the pump. Not the corporate part, the engineering part, the condition, the alarm state, the bolus. She went completely quiet. And then my daughter said, Mom, say the alarm sequence again. I said, soft occlusion alarm, silenced at the panel but not cleared. And then the line clears on its own or somebody straightens it. And Iris said, we call that a ghost bolus. I said, what? She said, Mom, we have a name for it. Not the company's name. Ours, nurses. It's a thing people say on units. Watch that pump, it ghosted on me last week. I have heard 3 different nurses say it in 2 hospitals. I sat down in my kitchen. She said, in 2024, we had a lady, post-Whipple, on Dilaudid. Her sat dropped, and she went up NAIC, and we pushed Narcan, and she came back, and nobody ever knew why. And the charge nurse said ghost bolus. It happens with those, and we put a note in the chart that said possible pump-related event, and moved on because it was 4 in the morning, and we had 11 other patients. She said, Mom, is that our pump? Our pump. She'd grown up on it. She was 7 years old the first time she came to a family day and got a hold of cassette. I said, Iris, did anybody file a complaint with the manufacturer? And there was a silence on that phone that I would like every executive in America to have to sit through one time. Then she said, Mom, nobody files. Do you know how long the form takes? Nobody files. That's the thing, nobody understands about how this works. The system assumes the complaints come in. All of it, the whole regulatory architecture of medical devices in this country, assumes that when something goes wrong, somebody reports it. And in a real hospital at 4 in the morning with 11 patients, almost nobody does. So the 22 complaints I found were never 22 events. They were 22 reports. Bernie's math, done later by people much better at statistics than me, put the actual number of post-occlusion bolus events on 11,400 pumps over 5 years somewhere between 400 and 1,100. Iris said, what are you going to do? And I made a mistake. I want to own it. I said, I'm handling it. Because I did not want my 26-year-old daughter carrying this while she worked nights. She said, Mom, that's not an answer. I said, it's the one I've got today. She said, okay, in the voice she has used since she was 4 when she is deciding to let something go for now, and absolutely not forever. Then she said, is Dad okay? And I said, Dad's okay. Which was true on December 9th. It stopped being true on January 22nd, but I'll get there. Doreen Whatley lives in a ranch house in Springfield, Ohio, with a wind chime made out of forks on the porch, and I sat in her living room on December 13th for 2 hours. Bernie gave me her number. He'd had it in his phone for 3 years and had never once dialed it. I did not go there to get anything. I want to say that clearly because I've thought about whether it was right to go at all. I went because I had spent 6 months reading a spreadsheet where she was a row, and I did not think I should be allowed to do what I was about to do without sitting in her living room first. Her mother was named Patricia Ann Whatley. She was 81. She went into Springfield Regional in March of 2022 for a hip revision, which went perfectly. She was on a hydromorphone PCA on the 3rd floor. She was supposed to go to rehab on a Thursday. On Tuesday night at 1:40 in the morning, she stopped breathing. Doreen said, they told us it was her heart. She said she was 81 and she had a fib, and I believed them. Why wouldn't I believe them? These are good people, the nurse cried. Then she said, I got the records in 2023 because my brother wanted them for something else. There's a line in there. It says the infusion pump alarmed at 1:12 and was silenced. And then at 1:38, there's a note that says the line was repositioned. She looked at me. She said, I've read that page probably 400 times, and I don't know what it means. Do you know what it means? And I want to tell you the hardest thing I have ever done in my professional life. And it took place in a living room in Springfield, with a wind chime made out of forks going on the porch. I said, Mrs. Whatley, I think I do. But if I tell you what I think and I'm wrong, I will have done something to you that I can't undo. And if I'm right, then there is a way to prove it that doesn't depend on me, and it will take months, and it will be public. She said, Are you a lawyer? I said, No, ma'am. I ran quality for the company that made the pump. Doreen Whatley looked at me for a long time. Then she said, Did you know? And I said, I opened an investigation in June of last year, and they fired me in September and closed it 9 days later. She said, So you didn't know when my mother died? I said, No. I found out in June, 4 years later, because I read 22 files in a row that nobody had ever read in a row. She said, Then why do you look like that? And I said, Because I've been in that building since 1999, Mrs. Whatley, and there's a version of me that could have read those files in 2019. She got up and got me a glass of water I hadn't asked for, which is what women of a certain kind in Ohio do when a conversation gets too big for the room. Then she sat back down and she said, My mother was a switchboard operator at Robbins and Myers for 31 years. She had a 5th grade sense of fairness. If she was here, she'd tell you, Don't come tell me you're sorry, go make them stop. She said, So go make them stop, and when you can tell me, tell me. I got in my car, and I sat in her driveway for a while. 4 days later, Trevor Lang texted my phone and asked me to dinner, and I said yes, and I want you to know exactly what was in my head when I walked into that restaurant. The state of Ohio allows any party to a conversation to record it. I had confirmed that with Adele Ferrero on December 8th, in writing, for an entirely different reason. He picked the restaurant in the lobby of the Marriott downtown, which is where you take somebody when you want it to look like a coincidence. He got there first. He stood up when I came in. He asked about Marcus, and this is what people never believe about men like Trevor Lang. He actually listened to the answer for a full 90 seconds. Then he said, Claire, I owe you an apology and I'm going to give it to you straight. The way that separation was handled was wrong. The timing was indefensible. I found out afterward and I was angry. That is a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because the termination approval memo had his electronic signature on it dated September 8th, which I did not have yet but was certain existed, and which I had by February. I said, Thank you. He ordered a glass of wine. I ordered iced tea because I wanted to be the most sober person in Ohio. My phone was face down on the table with a voice memo running. It ran for 51 minutes. I'm going to give you the parts that mattered. He started with the inspection demand. He was light about it. He said, So your lawyer sent us a very interesting letter. 1990, whatever preferred stock. Ford about had a stroke. I said nothing. He said, Look, I'll be honest, We're not going to fight you on a technicality. That's not who we are. But I want to understand what you're actually after, because if this is about the retention award, that is a solvable problem and we can solve it tonight. I said, what's the number? Because I wanted to see it. And Trevor Lang said, 2.1. $2.1 million. Nearly double what the severance had been worth. From a man who had said in September that my position was eliminated for strategic reasons. I said, that's a lot of money for a technicality. He laughed. He has a good laugh. He said, Claire, do you know what a day of delay costs on this deal? Financing's committed at a rate that expires. There's an outside date in March. Kestrel's got 2 other targets in the pipeline and a board that isn't in love with this one. 2.1 is cheap. 2.1 is rounding. Then he leaned in, and his voice changed. It got confidential and warm. And this is the register in which Trevor Lang did all of his real damage. He said, and between us, I'd rather write that check to you than to anybody. You built that department. You covered for a lot of people for a lot of years. I said, what does the check buy? He said, consent to the merger. Full release. The confidentiality provision, which, Claire, come on, you had that in your original agreement anyway. And I said, and Section 6C. He didn't blink. He said, and a rep that you're not sitting on a safety issue, yeah. And I said, Trevor, why does that clause exist? Here is where he made his mistake, and I want to describe why he made it, because it wasn't stupidity. It was that he had decided, somewhere between the appetizers and the wine, that I had a price and that he had found it. And once a man like Trevor Lang believes he has bought you, he starts talking to you like a colleague again. That's not a flaw in him. That's the whole engine. He said, because of 117. Obviously. I said, you told me 117 was a training problem. And Trevor Lang said, Claire, I told you it was a training problem in June, because in June I had a term sheet on my desk and a diligence window opening in August. And if I had greenlit a design investigation on a flagship product in June, Kestrel walks. Not negotiates. Walks. And then in 18 months we fail the covenant test and a distressed fund buys this company for $400 million and moves the line to Juarez and 1,100 people are out. I said, so you closed it. He said, I didn't close anything. The COPPA closed on the merits. I said, it closed 9 days after you fired the only person qualified to keep it open. And he said, and this is the sentence. This is the 11 words that got read into a record twice. Claire, everybody in that building knew that COPPA closed when you did. Then he sat back and he said, more gently, look, here's what's true and nobody wants to say it out loud. If the design issue is real, Kestrel finds it in 18 months with a real engineering budget and they fix it under their name, and it gets fixed faster than we could ever fix it, because we're broke. If it's not real, we blew up a company over a hypothesis. Either way, the deal is the right outcome. I'm not the villain here. I'm the guy who has to hold the whole thing together, while everybody else gets to have principles. I said, how many pumps are in service tonight? He said, 11,400. He knew the number, without a pause. He'd been carrying that number around exactly like I had. I said, Trevor, is there any part of you that thinks about that at 2 a.m? And Trevor Lang looked at me and said, honestly, which was the worst part? Every night. And then I get up and go do the job, because that's what the job is. I said I'd think about the offer. He said, take a week, and Claire hug Marcus for me. He paid. He hugged me in the lobby. He was, all the way to the valet stand, completely sincere. I got in my car, and I drove 3 blocks and pulled into a parking garage, and stopped the recording at 51 minutes and 4 seconds, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel. He had said the COPPA closed when I did. He had said the timing of the diligence window was the reason he called it a training problem. He had said Kestrel walks. He had no idea what he had just done, because in his mind he had just been candid, and candor is the most expensive habit a man like that can have. I emailed the file to Adele Ferrero at 9:41 p.m. with the subject line, minute 31. She called me at 10:15. She said, Claire, do not answer his next call. I said, why? And she said, Because in about 9 days, he's going to figure out you didn't take the money, and then this stops being a negotiation. They filed on December 23rd. I want you to sit with the date. December 23rd. At 4:51 in the afternoon, which is 11 minutes before the clerk's office closed for the holiday, which means nobody could respond to anything until the 29th. That is not an accident. That is a choice a person makes on purpose, and somebody at a very good law firm billed for making it. They filed 2 lawsuits. The first was in the Delaware Court of Chancery. Havorson Medical Systems, Inc. v. Claire E. Whitfield. A declaratory judgment action asking the court to rule that the series, a 1 preferred stock, had been constructively redeemed in 2009, that I had abandoned any rights thereunder by 21 years of non-assertion, that the 2011 ratification was a scrivener's error, and that, in the alternative, I had waived the protective provisions by accepting employment compensation. 4 theories. Adele had predicted 4 theories and named 3 of them exactly. The second was in the Court of Common Pleas in Montgomery County, Ohio. That one was called Havorson Medical Systems, Inc. v. Whitfield 2, and it alleged misappropriation of trade secrets, breach of confidentiality obligations, breach of the duty of loyalty, and tortious interference with a business relationship. It asked for a temporary restraining order and injunctive relief. It asked for damages in excess of $25,000, which is Ohio pleading language and means as much as we can get. And attached to it was an affidavit from Whitney Cole, Chief People Officer, sworn under penalty of perjury, stating on information and belief that I had, prior to my separation, transferred confidential company information to personal devices and had subsequently used it to contact current employees and third parties for the purpose of interfering with a pending transaction. On information and belief, those 4 words are how a lawyer says we have no idea if this is true. I had taken nothing. Not 1 file, not 1 screenshot, not 1 email. I had made that decision on the night of September 12th, standing in my backyard, and for 3.5 months it had felt like fighting with 1 hand tied behind me, and on December 23rd at 4:51 p.m., it became the most valuable thing I owned. Because their forensic examiner got my devices in February. 2 laptops, a phone, an iPad, a desktop that hadn't been turned on since 2019, and a Western Digital drive full of Iris's dance recitals. The report came back on February 26th, 11 pages. The relevant sentence is on page 9. No artifacts consistent with the transfer, storage, or exfiltration of Havorson Medical Systems data were identified on any custodian device. Adele read that out loud to me over the phone and then said, "Claire, do you know how rare that is? In 22 years, I have never once had a clean forensics report. Everybody takes something. Everybody emails themselves the org chart." I said, "I ran the training that says don't." But that was February, and this was December, and in between were the worst 9 weeks of my life, and I'm not going to skip them, because if I do, you'll think this was easy. The TRO hearing was December 29th. We won it. The judge denied the restraining order because they had no evidence, which is what happens when you plead on information and belief in front of a judge who has been on the bench for 26 years. But we won. It cost $11,000 in 3 days, and Adele was fronting all of it. On January 6th, a process server came to my house at 7:15 in the morning and served me at my front door in a bathrobe, in front of my neighbor Ellen, who was getting her paper. On January 9th, somebody sent a link to the Ohio complaint to the alumni newsletter of the Professional Society, where I had been on the board since 2018. On January 14th, the board asked me to step back from the officer role pending resolution. On January 15th, a recruiter I'd worked with for a decade called me and said, gently, "Claire, I have to be honest with you. I put you forward for the VP QA role at a company in Indianapolis, and their general counsel pulled up a docket search. He said, it's not that they think you did it. It's that nobody hires the defendant. There it is. That's the whole play. You don't have to win the lawsuit. You just have to file it, and then the person is unemployable while it's pending, and the pendency is entirely under your control. I understood, in a way I had not before, exactly what it costs to be right when you are not the one holding the checkbook. And on January 19th, at a little after 6 in the evening, with a scan 4 days away and a pot of soup on the stove, the chief people officer of Haverson Medical Systems rang my doorbell. Whitney Cole came to my house on January 19th. It was a Monday, a little after 6 in the evening, dark already, and I was making soup because soup was the only thing Marcus could get down that week. The doorbell rang, and I looked through the glass, and it was the chief people officer of Haverson Medical Systems, standing on my porch in a wool coat with her hands in her pockets. I want to tell you that I felt something dramatic. I didn't. I felt tired. I opened the door about 18 inches. She said, "Claire, I'm sorry. I know. I said, "Whitney, are you here on behalf of the company?" She said, "No." I said, "Then you shouldn't be here at all, and I'm represented, and you know that." She said, I know, 2 minutes. I stood there in the doorway of my own house with a wooden spoon in my hand, and I let her have the 2 minutes, and I'm still not entirely sure why. I think it was because she looked genuinely unwell, and because 6 years is 6 years, and because I have never in my life been able to close a door on a person who is standing in the cold. She said, "I signed an affidavit." I said, "I read it." And she said, "Claire, I didn't write it. Outside counsel wrote it. They sent it to me at 9:40 at night on the 22nd with the filing deadline the next day, and it said on information and belief, and they told me that phrase means you're not personally attesting, you're relaying what the company believes." I said, "Whitney, you swore it under penalty of perjury." She said, "I know what I did." She had started to cry a little, in the way people do when they are furious at themselves, and it comes out the wrong door. She said, "Did you take anything? I need to know. They told me there was a forensic hold and an indicator, and I asked twice for the actual evidence, and nobody ever showed it to me." And I said, "No, I never took one document. And when your examiner gets my devices in February, that's exactly what he's going to find. And then your affidavit is going to be the only piece of paper in the case that isn't true." She stood there on my porch and absorbed that. Then she said the thing that made me understand her completely, and that I have thought about ever since. She said, "Claire, I have $4.2 million in that deal." Not as a threat, not as a boast. She said it the way a person tells you their diagnosis. She said, "I'm 41. My husband hasn't worked since 2021. My mother's in memory care in Springboro, and it's $9,400 a month. That money that's the whole thing. That's everything." And I said, "I know exactly what that is. In 2004, I cashed out my retirement for that building." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She said, "So what do I do?" I want you to understand what I did next, because I've turned it over 100 times, and I would do it again, and I'm still not sure it was kind. I told her the truth, which is that there was a way out, and that it was going to cost her everything she had just described. I said, "Whitney, listen to me carefully, because I ran compliance for 26 years, and I have watched this exact moment happen to 4 other people. Tomorrow morning, you call an employment lawyer who does not work for Havorson, and you pay for it yourself. Not the company's lawyer, yours. Then you file a corrective affidavit with the court. You don't recant anything you actually know. You state, precisely, what you were told by whom, and what you did and did not personally verify. You will be terminated inside of 2 weeks. You will forfeit the 4.2. And in 18 months, when the government is deciding who to charge, you will be the person who corrected the record before anybody made them." She looked at me for a long moment. And then Whitney Cole said, "There has to be another way." I said, "There isn't. There's just a slower one." She said, "You're asking me to blow up my mother's care over a paragraph." And I said, "No, Whitney. I'm telling you what the paragraph costs. You're the one who's going to decide." She stood on my porch for another few seconds. Then she said, "Thank you for talking to me," and she went back to her car, and she sat in my driveway with the engine running for what felt like 4 or 5 minutes, and then she backed out and drove away. She did not file a corrective affidavit. I checked the docket every Monday for 11 weeks. And on the 19th day after the special meeting in April, she was terminated anyway, and the sanctions opinion that has her name in it came out the same afternoon. And she lost the $4.2 million regardless, because Trevor Lang was fired for cause, and the equity pool got clawed back, and it turned out that the thing she had been protecting was never actually hers to protect. That's the part that has stayed with me longer than anything Trevor Lang ever said. She could have had the truth for free in January. In May, she lost the money anyway and had to pay for the lie on top of it. I went back inside and finished the soup, and I did not tell Marcus who had been at the door, because he was 7 days from a restaging scan, and I had gotten very good by then at deciding what he needed to carry. The scan was on the 22nd. The tumor had not shrunk the way they wanted. It had not grown. It had not spread. But the response was what the oncologist called partial and less than we'd hoped, and it meant they wanted 2 more cycles of a harder regimen before surgery, and it meant surgery moved from February to April, and it meant April was going to be an esophagectomy, which is a 9-hour operation that removes most of a person's esophagus and pulls their stomach up into their chest. Marcus took it better than I did. He has always taken things better than I do. He said, so we go 2 more rounds, and then he asked the doctor a question about whether he could still conduct the spring concert in May. I sat in the parking garage afterward, and I did the arithmetic that I had been not doing for 4 months. Savings, $9,200. Home equity line, drawn to $41,000 of a $60,000 limit. Cobra, $1,806 a month, which I had been paying since October, because Marcus's district insurance covered him, but not the out-of-network surgical team we needed, and because I had a hysterectomy in 2019 and a pre-existing everything. Adele's costs, which she was fronting and which I could see on the invoices she sent me marked no payment DUE, $58,000. Income, $0 since September 12th. And on the other side of the ledger, a text message from Trevor Lang that had come in on January 3rd and that I had not answered, that said, Claire offer stands, 2.1. This can be done in 48 HRS. Nobody wants this. $2.1 million. I want to tell you what I actually did, because this is the part of the story that people don't tell. On the night of January 22nd, after Marcus went to bed, I opened my laptop and I typed a reply to that text. I wrote, Trevor, I'd like to discuss. Are you available Friday? And I sat there with my thumb over the send button for, I don't know, 4 minutes, 6. I want you to understand that I was not weak in that moment. I was 57 years old and I had a husband who needed a 9-hour surgery and a daughter with $81,000 in loans, and a lawyer who was going to end up $60,000 in the hole for me if I lost. And I had a legal right to $2.1 million and a release, and every single practical person in my life would have told me to take it. And I'll tell you what I was thinking, and it wasn't noble. I was thinking, the recall will happen eventually. Kestrel's engineers are good. In 18 months they'll find it. Trevor's not even wrong. That's how it works. That is exactly how it works. Nobody ever decides to let people die. They decide that somebody else will handle it on a slightly slower schedule. I did not send it that night. I fell asleep on the couch with the laptop open. At 5:40 in the morning, my phone buzzed, and it was a text from a number I didn't have saved, and it said, Mrs. Whitfield, this is Doreen Whatley. I don't know if this is still your number. I am not asking for anything. I found my mother's switchboard pin from Robbins and Myers when I was cleaning out the closet. 31 years. I just wanted to tell somebody who would understand what that means. I hope your husband is doing all right. I sat up on that couch at 5:45 in the morning in a dark house. Then I deleted the draft, and I called Adele Ferrero at 7, and I said, how do I get in a room with the buyer? She said, you don't. Kestrel's counsel will not speak to you, because you are an adverse party in litigation with their target, and any contact is a tortious interference exhibit. I said, then how? And Adele Ferrero said, there's exactly one door and it's very narrow, and if we do it wrong you go to jail for securities fraud, so listen carefully. Here is the door. In a public company merger, the target's shareholders have to vote. To vote, they get a proxy statement, and the proxy statement is a document filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it is public, and anybody in America can read it. And any shareholder at all, including one who owns $1,800 of a weird little preferred series, has the right to file something called a Schedule 13D if they hold a class of registered stock, or, more simply and more powerfully, to send a letter to the board of directors and file it publicly as an exhibit. You do not contact the buyer. You put the information where the buyer's lawyers are legally required to look. Adele Ferrero drafted it over 4 days. It was 9 pages. It was addressed to the board of directors of Havorson Medical Systems, Inc., and copied to the corporate secretary, and it was filed publicly on February 2nd. It did 4 things in order. 1. It asserted, with the certified Delaware filings attached as Exhibit A, that the Series A1 preferred stock remained outstanding, that the holder's written consent was required for the merger, and that no such consent had been given or would be given on the current terms. 2. It noted, without characterization, that the company's Section 3, for representation in the merger agreement stated that no consent of any other person was required, and requested that the board advise whether it intended to amend that disclosure. 3. It renewed the Section 6 inspection demand and appended a Delaware Section 220 books and records demand as a belt and suspenders, specifically listing all files relating to COPPA 240117, the document titled Complaint Coding Harmonization Initiative, complaint files for the Meridian 3 for a defined 5-year period, and all correspondence with the FDA regarding delivery accuracy. 4. And this was Adele's masterpiece. It stated, in a single flat sentence with no adjectives, that the holder had reason to believe the company had, in the 11 months preceding the execution of the merger agreement, adopted a complaint classification procedure with the effect of removing from investigation a category of adverse events associated with a specific and reproducible device behavior, and that the holder intended to pursue inspection of those records. No accusation, no numbers, no 19 deaths, nothing that could be called defamatory, and nothing a defense lawyer could throw back at us as an unproven claim. It was, functionally, a set of coordinates. Adele said, "We're not telling them the answer. We're telling them where to dig, in a document their buyer's lawyers are professionally required to read within 24 hours. We filed it at 9:02 in the morning on Monday, February 2nd. At 9:14, Havorson's stock dropped 4%. At 10:30, a trade publication called MedTech Dive published a 2-paragraph item. At 1:15 in the afternoon, my phone rang from a 610 area code, which is suburban Philadelphia, which is where Kestrel Medical Group has its headquarters. Adele had told me not to answer any call from anybody. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail said, "Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Rosalind Tavers. I'm the Deputy General Counsel of Kestrel Medical Group. I'm aware that you're represented and I am not calling to speak with you directly. I'm going to hang up and call your counsel. I would like you to know that we have read your letter and that we have suspended the satisfaction of a condition precedent. Thank you. We have suspended the satisfaction of a condition precedent." I did not know what that meant. Adele did. She called me back 40 minutes later, and she was, for the only time in the entire year I knew her, audibly emotional. She said, "Claire, they stopped the deal. Rosalind Tavers is 61, went to Rutgers, spent 11 years at the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel before she went in-house, and is exactly as pleasant as a person needs to be and not 1 degree more." We met on February 9th in a conference room in Chicago because it was neutral ground, and because Adele wanted it on video with a court reporter present, which Kestrel agreed to instantly, which told us a lot. Present, Roz Tavers, 2 Kestrel lawyers, a woman from Kestrel's quality organization named Dr. Anik Ball, who had a legal pad and did not speak for 90 minutes and then spoke for 40. Adele. Me, a videographer. Nobody from Havorson. Havorson did not know the meeting was happening. Roz Tavers started by saying, Mrs. Whitfield, I want to set expectations. Kestrel is not your ally. We are the buyer. Our interests and yours may overlap for a period, and then they will diverge. I'd rather say that now than have you discover it in April. I said, thank you. That's the first honest thing anybody's said to me since September. Then she said, tell me about the pump. And I talked for 4 hours and 11 minutes. I did not have a single document. I want you to appreciate that. I sat in a conference room in Chicago with a court reporter and the deputy general counsel of a $40 billion company, and I had no files, no exhibits, no screenshots, no notebooks. I had a legal pad with my own handwriting on it and 26 years in my head. I gave them the mechanism. Occlusion, alarm state, firmware revision, cassette size, the volume math. I gave them COPPA 240117, the number, the date I opened it, the language I used, the date it closed, and the reason code, which I knew because Adele had gotten it from the public FDA establishment inspection history without ever asking Havorson for anything. I gave them the coding harmonization initiative, its name, its month, the 4 narrative phrases, and the routing outcome, as reported to me verbally by a current employee whose name I refused 3 times to give them, and Roz Tavers nodded and stopped asking. I gave them the 22 complaints, and the 11 hospitals, and the 19 deaths. And at the end, Dr. Annick Ball, who had not said a word in 90 minutes, put down her pen and said, in a Dutch accent, one question. Mrs. Whitfield, firmware 4.2.1, was there a 4.2.2? And I said, yes, released in November 2019. It changed the occlusion alarm latch behavior, and it was documented as a usability enhancement. Dr. Ball wrote something down. Then she looked at Roz Tavers and said, they fixed it in 2019 and did not call it a fix. The room was very quiet. Because if that was true, and it was, and the engineering change order proved it in March, then it was no longer a question of whether the company knew. It was a question of what happened to the 11,400 pumps in the field that were never updated, because updating them would have been a field action, and a field action is a recall, and a recall has to be reported. At the end, Roz Tavers closed her folder and said, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to tell you what happens now because you've earned that. We are not going to walk from this deal. Everyone assumes we will. We won't, because we still want the sales channel and the Xiamen facility. What we are going to do is exercise our diligence rights under Section 5, 2, which are extremely broad, and put 9 of our own quality people into that building for 3 weeks. We will find what you have told us, or we will find that it isn't there. If it's there, this becomes a price and indemnity conversation, and a very unpleasant few months for some people you used to work with. And Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be very clear about this last part because your counsel will tell you the same thing. If it's there, we have our own reporting obligations. This will not stay a business dispute. I said meaning. And Roz Tavers said, meaning the government. I drove home from Chicago that night, 5 hours, and I stopped at a Culver's outside Merrillville, Indiana, and ate a fish sandwich in my car in the parking lot at 9 at night, and I called Marcus. He said, how'd it go? And I said, I think I just handed 1,900 people's jobs to a stranger from New Jersey. And Marcus Whitfield said, no, honey, you handed her a pump. Kestrel's team went into the building on February 16th. 9 people, badges, conference room 2B on the 2nd floor, which used to be my department's training room. Havorson could not stop them. Section 5. 2 of a signed merger agreement gives the buyer access, and refusing access when the buyer asks is the single loudest thing a target can do. Trevor Lang did what Trevor Lang does. He was gracious. He personally set up the room. He brought them coffee. He told the leadership team it was routine confirmatory diligence. On February 19th, a Thursday, Kestrel's quality lead asked for the electronic audit trail on COPPA 240117. Not the COPPA, the audit trail, which is the log of who opened it, who touched it, who changed a field, and when, down to the second with the user ID. which cannot be deleted, which is a control that I designed in 2016 and validated in 2017 and defended in front of the FDA in 2019, and which sat there for 6 years being nothing but an annoyance to everybody who had to use it. The audit trail showed that on September 21st at 4:47 p.m., the copper record was accessed by a user ID belonging to a senior manager of quality systems, and the closure reason field was populated, and the record was electronically signed. And it showed that 11 minutes earlier, at 4:36 p.m., that same record had been accessed by a different user ID. F. Bellamy, the chief financial officer of the company. A man who had, in his entire career, never once logged into the quality management system, because there is no reason on God's earth for a CFO to have a license for it, except that he'd been given one in 2019 for a cost of quality reporting project, and nobody ever turned it off. He had opened the copper record 11 minutes before it was closed. Bernie Ochoa told me later that, on the afternoon of February 20th, Ford Bellamy walked across the plant floor to the break room and stood there for a long time looking at the vending machine without buying anything. On February 23rd, Havorson's outside counsel filed a motion in Delaware to expedite the declaratory judgment action. On February 25th, they withdrew it. On February 26th, the forensic report on my devices came back clean, and Adele filed it with the Ohio court along with a motion for sanctions. And on March 2nd, and I got this from 3 different people who were in the building, Trevor Lang called an all-hands meeting in the cafeteria and told 1,100 employees that a former executive with a personal grievance was attempting to extract a payment by making unsubstantiated allegations about product safety, that the company had full confidence in the Meridian 3, and that anyone contacted by outside parties should refer them to legal. Bernie Ochoa was standing at the back by the milk cooler. He told me on the phone that night, Claire, he said your name. I said, what'd he say? And Bernie said, he said, Claire Whitfield, just like that. And then he said, and I'll leave it there, which is what a man says when he wants everybody to fill in the rest. Then Bernie said, something else happened though. I said, what? And he said, when it broke up, nobody clapped. He said, Claire, that man has done 30 all hands in that cafeteria, and people always clap. There's 400 people in there, and it was quiet as a church, and everybody just picked up their trays. Then he said, you want to know what I think? I think everybody in that building already knows something's wrong with that pump, and nobody's ever been allowed to say it out loud. And today he said it out loud for them, and it came out backwards. 2 days after that, Trevor Lang made the mistake that ended him. He decided that the problem was Bernie Ochoa. On March 4th, at 9:20 in the morning, Bernie Ochoa was called off the floor to a conference room where 2 people from corporate security and a lawyer from an outside firm were waiting. They asked him whether he had been in contact with me. He said yes. They asked what he'd told me. He said my own memory. They asked him to surrender his personal cell phone for imaging. He said no. They told him he was being placed on paid administrative leave pending an investigation into unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, and that he needed to surrender his badge and be escorted from the building. Bernie Ochoa is 63 years old and has worked in that building since 1991, and his pension multiplier steps up at 35 years, which was 20 months away. He said, am I fired? They said it was an investigation. He said, then I'll be here Monday, and he set his badge on the table and walked out to his truck by himself, past the line, past bench 4, past a wall with a photograph on it of the 1994 company picnic in which he is 29 years old and holding a horseshoe. He called me from the parking lot. He did not sound upset. He sounded like a man reading a gauge. He said, Claire, they just made this a whole lot easier for you, and I don't think they know it. And then Trevor Lang did the thing. On March 6th, Havorson Medical Systems, through counsel, sent a letter to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Ohio and to the FBI field office in Cincinnati, reporting a suspected theft of trade secrets by a former officer, and requesting that the matter be reviewed for criminal referral under the Defend Trade Secrets Act. They sent me a copy. That was the point. You send the target a copy so they'll settle. I want you to imagine getting that letter. I want you to imagine being 57 and standing in your kitchen with a husband upstairs who is 2 weeks from a 9-hour surgery, holding a letter that says the FBI has been asked to look at you. I sat down on the floor, actually on the floor with my back against the dishwasher. Then I called Adele Ferrero, and I read it to her. And Adele Ferrero started laughing. I said, Adele. She said, Claire, I'm sorry. Give me a second. She said, do you understand what they just did? They just invited a federal agency to open a file on Havorson Medical Systems. She said, the FBI doesn't investigate you. The FBI investigates the allegation. And the first thing they do is call the company and say, okay, walk us through what she took and why she took it. And the company has to say, well, we believe she may have information about our complaint handling procedures. She said, and then a federal agent who talks to other federal agents and who has a colleague 11 miles away at the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, because they share a building in Cincinnati, writes that sentence down. Then she stopped laughing. She said, Claire, this is going to get very serious very fast now, and not in the way they think. Is Marcus's surgery scheduled? I said April 9th. She said, then let's get you through April 9th, because the special meeting is April 28th. The special meeting of stockholders of Havorson Medical Systems, Inc., for the purpose of voting on the adoption of the agreement and plan of merger, had been noticed for Tuesday, April 28th at 10:00 a.m. at the company's principal executive offices at 4100 Dryden Road, Dayton, Ohio. Which is the plant, which means the cafeteria, which means 400 chairs, a podium, a banner, 1,100 employees who could walk down the hall, and every retiree in Montgomery County who owned 100 shares from the 2014 offering. Trevor Lang had chosen that venue himself in November, when the deal was a victory lap. I looked at the notice on my kitchen table on the 6th of March, and I thought about Gordon Havorson sliding a folder across a desk in 2004 and saying, don't ever let them take that paper back. And I called Adele and said, do I have a right to attend? And she said, Claire, you're a stockholder of a class entitled to vote separately on this transaction. You don't have a right to attend. She said, without you, there is no meeting. Marcus had his surgery on April 9th at Ohio State, and it took 10 hours and 40 minutes, and I sat in a waiting room on the 4th floor with Iris, who had flown in from Denver and taken 2 weeks of PTO she did not have. I'm going to skip most of it, because it belongs to us and not to a story about a company. But I'll tell you 2 things. The first is that at hour 7, a volunteer came around with a cart, and Iris and I both looked up, and the cart had an infusion pump strapped to the side of it for a patient transport down the hall, and it was a Meridian 3, and my daughter and I looked at each other, and neither one of us said anything. The second is that at hour 9, Iris said, Mom, why won't you tell me what you're actually doing? And I was too tired to manage her, so I told her all of it. Every piece. The certificate of designation, the letter, Kestrel, the FBI referral, the meeting on the 28th. She listened to the whole thing with her knees pulled up in a waiting room chair. Then she said, okay, so I'm coming. I said, Iris, you have to go back on the 19th. And my daughter said, Mom, I have watched you not talk about your work for 26 years. I'm coming to the meeting. I'll fly back that night. Marcus came out of surgery at 8:20 in the evening. He was extubated the next morning. He said his first word to me at 6:40 a.m. on April 10th, and the word was chair because he wanted to sit up, and he was up and walking a lap of the unit that afternoon with 2 chest tubes because he is a middle school band director and they are made of a material that has not been identified by science. He came home on April 17th. On April 14th, while he was still on the surgical floor, and I was reading it on my phone in a chair beside his bed, 3 investigators from the FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs and 1 special agent from the Office of Criminal Investigations arrived unannounced at 4100 Dryden Road, Dayton, Ohio, at 8:00 in the morning and presented a Form 482. A Form 482 is a notice of inspection. When it comes with an OCI agent standing next to it, it is not a routine inspection. They were there for 9 days. On the last day, they issued a Form 483, which is the list of observations, and a Form 483 is a public document, and it went up on the FDA's website 11 days later, and I read all 6 observations sitting at my own kitchen table. I'm going to give you 2 of them, in the agency's own language, because the FDA writes in a voice that is somehow more devastating for being completely flat. Observation 1. Procedures for corrective and preventive action have not been adequately established. Specifically, COPPA 240117 opened 632,025 to address a potential systemic design deficiency associated with unintended bolus delivery following occlusion clearance, was closed on 9,212,025, with reason code not substantiated without documented root cause investigation, without testing, and without engineering assessment. Audit trail review indicates the record was accessed by the Chief Financial Officer 11 minutes prior to closure. Observation 3. Complaint handling procedures were revised in May 2025 in a manner that resulted in the reclassification of complaint narratives describing unintended medication delivery to a category not subject to investigation or adverse event evaluation. Firm was unable to provide documentation of a risk assessment supporting this revision. Review of complaint files identified 31 complaints so reclassified, including 19 involving patient death. 31. I had found 22. There were 31. Kestrel's people found the other 9 in 3 weeks with a badge and a subpoena, and none of the fear. Haverson's stock lost 31% on the day the 483 posted. And on April 22nd, 6 days before the special meeting, Trevor Lang called Adele Ferrero directly and offered me $6 million. She put him on hold and called me on my cell. She said 6, plus fees, plus a mutual dismissal, plus he'll issue a statement retracting the March 2nd all-hands remarks, plus Bernie Ochoa gets reinstated with back pay. I was standing in my kitchen, and Marcus was on the couch 11 feet away with a feeding tube in his stomach, watching a documentary about the Grand Coulee Dam, and I looked at him, and he had figured out from my face who it was, and he made a very small gesture with his hand that meant go ahead. I'm fine. I said, Adele, does the offer include the recall? She went back on the other line. She came back 40 seconds later, and she said, he says a recall decision is a regulatory determination that can't be part of a private settlement. And I said, then tell him no, and tell him I'll see him Tuesday. The morning of April 28th was 61 degrees and gray, and I got up at 4:40 because I had not slept. I want to walk you through what a special meeting of stockholders actually is, because most people have never been to one, and it matters enormously. It is not a rally. It is a legal proceeding. There is a chair who is usually the CEO. There is a corporate secretary who keeps the record. And there is an inspector of elections who is required by Delaware law, who is almost always an independent third party, and whose entire job, sworn, statutory, and not subject to the chairman's authority, is to determine who is a stockholder, count the votes, and certify the result. The chair runs the meeting. The inspector of elections decides who gets to vote. That distinction is the whole ball game, and Trevor Lang did not understand it on the morning of April 28th, because he had never once needed to. We got there at 9:20. Me, in a Navy suit I bought in 2019 for an FDA inspection. Iris, 26, in scrubs because her flight back was at 6:40 that night and she had come straight from a red eye. Adele Ferrero, with a rolling file box. Dolores Havorson, 79, driven by her son, holding a purse and a stock certificate for 61,000 shares of common stock, wearing the pin Gordon gave her for the company's 25th anniversary. And Bernie Ochoa, in a sport coat, who had been on unpaid, then unpaid administrative leave for 8 weeks, and who owned 411 shares he'd bought through the employee stock purchase plan starting in 2015. The cafeteria was set up for 300 and they had 440. People were standing along the wall by the milk cooler. There were retirees. There were people I had hired. There were people in blue smocks who had come off second shift and stayed. There was a banner. It said Havorson Kestrel, a new chapter. At the registration table, a young man from the proxy solicitor's office checked names against a list. He found Dolores. He found Bernie. He found Iris's. She'd bought 11 shares in 2019 as a joke for my birthday, which I had forgotten and which turned out to matter. He did not find me. He said, "Ma'am, I'm not showing you on the list of record holders." And Whitney Cole appeared at his shoulder within about 4 seconds, which told me she'd been watching the door. She said, "Claire, hi, can I talk to you over here for a second?" We stepped aside. She said, "Claire, you're not a registered holder for this meeting, and you're also, I'm sorry to have to say this, you're subject to a no trespass notice on this property from September. I don't want to make this a thing. There's a coffee shop on Springboro Pike. Can I have someone call you when it's over?" And I said, "Whitney, is the inspector of elections here?" She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "The inspector of elections. Delaware General Corporation Law Section 231. Is she here?" Whitney Cole said, "I'd have to check." And Adele Ferrero said, from behind me, in the most pleasant voice imaginable, "She's the woman in the gray blazer at the table by the podium with the ballot box, and we're going to go speak with her now." Her name was MS. Ademi, and she worked for a proxy services firm in Cleveland, and she had done 400 of these, and I would like to buy her lunch every year for the rest of my life. Adele put 3 things in front of her. A certified copy of the Certificate of Designation of Series, a 1 preferred stock, filed October 14, 2004, with the Delaware Secretary of State's authentication. A certified copy of the 2011 amended and restated Certificate of Incorporation, Article 4, Section 3C, with the ratification language highlighted. And the original engraved stock certificate for 1,800 shares, issued to Claire E. Whitfield, signed by Gordon R. Havorson as president. MS. Ademi read all 3. It took her about 4 minutes and she did not hurry and nobody hurried her. Then she picked up a phone and called somebody, and then she opened a laptop and pulled up the stock ledger the transfer agent had provided that morning, and she scrolled, and she stopped. She turned the laptop around so Adele could see it. There, on the ledger of Havorson Medical Systems, Inc., between the common stock summary and the treasury shares, was a line that had been carried forward by every transfer agent since 2004, because transfer agents carry everything forward. Series 1 preferred 1, 800 shares, holders of record. 1, Whitfield, Claire E. MS. Ademi said, "Ma'am, you're a record holder." She wrote something on a card and handed it to me, and she said, "Please take a seat in the front section. When the chair calls the item, I'll need you at the microphone." At 9:51, Trevor Lang came through the double doors from the hall with Ford Bellamy and Lorraine DeVers and 2 lawyers. He saw me in the second row. I watched his face, and I'm going to tell you exactly what was on it, because it was not fear. It was irritation. The specific irritation of a man who has to handle one more thing on a morning that was supposed to be clean. He crossed the room to Whitney Cole and said something. She said something back. He said something to one of the lawyers, and the lawyer went to MS. Ademi's table. I could not hear it. Adele could, because Adele had positioned herself 4 feet away, which is why you hire Adele Ferrero. The lawyer said the holder's status was disputed and subject to pending litigation in Delaware, and that the inspector should not seat her. And MS. Ademi said, and Adele wrote it down verbatim on a legal pad, and it is now in a transcript. "Counsel, the ledger says she's a holder. If you have an order from the Court of Chancery telling me otherwise, please hand it to me. Otherwise, I'm going to do my job." At 9:57, 2 men from plant security came and stood at the end of my row. Not close, just there. 440 people saw them, And at 9:58, Trevor Lang did the thing that finished him. And he did it because he had spent 7 years being the smartest man in every room in that building and had genuinely never once been told no by somebody who could not be fired. He walked to the podium 2 minutes early, tapped the microphone, and said, "Good morning, everybody. Before we start, we've got a small situation. There's an individual present who is subject to a no trespass notice on this property. Dayton police are on their way. It's nothing anybody needs to be concerned about and will be underway in a few minutes." 440 people turned around and looked at me. Bernie Ochoa stood up. He didn't say anything. He was 3 rows back and he just stood up, and he stayed standing, and he was 63 years old in a sport coat with 411 shares in his pocket. Then a woman named Charlotte Dees, who runs the sterilization line and has been there since 2002, stood up. Then a retiree named Walt Kimbrough, who is 81, stood up with a cane. Then Sunny Reyes, who had not told me she was coming and who was standing against the back wall in her badge, stood up straighter, which is all she could do because she was already standing. I have never in my life been so unable to breathe. 2 Dayton police officers came in at 10:06, and Ms. Adami, Inspector of Elections, walked out from behind her table, crossed in front of the podium, and intercepted them halfway up the center aisle. She said, loudly enough for the room, because she had been doing this for 20 years, and she knew exactly what she was doing. "Officers, I'm the independent inspector of elections for this meeting. That woman is a record holder of a class of stock entitled to vote on the matter before this meeting, and under Delaware law, she has the right to be present. If she's removed from this room, this meeting cannot be validly held, and I will not certify it." One of the officers looked at Trevor Lang. Trevor Lang, at the podium, in front of 440 people, and a banner that said a NEW chapter, said, That's a legal question. We can sort it out afterward. Let's just proceed. Let's just proceed." And that is the exact moment the room changed. I felt it. It went through 440 people like weather. Because every single person in that cafeteria had, at some point in the last 6 years, been in a meeting where Trevor Lang made a problem disappear by saying, "Let's just proceed." And this was the first time they had ever seen it not work. The officers stepped back against the wall. They stayed for the whole meeting. They were, I want to say, extremely professional, and one of them shook my hand afterward. At 10:11, Trevor Lang called the meeting to order. It went fast at first. Notice and quorum. The corporate secretary read the certification. Proposal 1, adoption of the agreement and plan of merger dated October 30th. Trevor did his part. He was good, even then. He talked about the 81-year history of the company and the strength of the combination and Gordon Havorson's legacy, and Dolores Havorson sat in the front row with her purse on her lap and did not move a muscle. Then he said, "The inspector will now report on the vote." And Ms. Adami stood up and said, "Mr. Chairman, before proxies are tabulated, the record reflects that Proposal 1 requires, in addition to the affirmative vote of a majority of the outstanding common stock, the separate written consent of the holders of a majority of the outstanding series, a 1 preferred stock, pursuant to Section 4A of the Certificate of Designation, filed October 14th, 2004, as ratified in the amended and restated Certificate of Incorporation. There is 1 holder of record of the series, a 1 preferred stock. She is present. Mrs. Whitfield, would you come to the microphone? I want to tell you what 440 people sounded like when they understood, all at once, that the woman 2 rows from the front had a veto. It sounded like nothing. It sounded like a room with no air in it. I walked up to the microphone in the center aisle. I had written something on an index card at 4:40 that morning, and I did not use it. Here's what I said, and I know it word for word because it is in the transcript, and because Iris recorded it on her phone from the 4th row, and I have watched it more times than I'd like to admit. I said, "Good morning. My name is Claire Whitfield. I worked in this building for 26 years. A lot of you know me. I hired some of you. I'm the holder of the series, a 1 preferred stock. I bought it in 2004 for $1,800, On top of $180,000 I put into this company in the worst week of its life, which was money I did not have, and which I got by cashing out my retirement at 36 years old. Most of you have never heard that, and there's no reason you would have. I'm not going to vote against this merger. You could hear the room shift. I think Kestrel should own this company. I think they'll run it better than it's been run. I want the jobs in this building to still be here in 10 years, and I think they will be. But I'm not going to give my consent this morning, and I'm going to tell you exactly why, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what I want, so that nobody in this room ever has to wonder what my price was. On May 12th of last year, this company changed the way complaints are classified so that reports of patients receiving unintended doses from a Meridian 3 stopped being investigated. 9 days ago, the FDA published a Form 483 confirming that 31 complaints were reclassified that way. 19 of them involved a patient death. On June 3rd, I opened a COPPA about it. On September 12th, I was terminated by video call while my husband was in a chemotherapy chair. On September 21st, that COPPA was closed as unsubstantiated, 11 minutes after the chief financial officer opened the record. There are 11,400 of those pumps in hospitals tonight. I looked at Trevor Lang for the only time. And there's one more thing that I don't think most of you know, and I'd like the record of this meeting to reflect that I said it out loud in this room. On July 18th of last year, 12 days before this merger agreement was signed, the compensation committee of this board amended the change of control severance plan. It used to pay 12 months to anybody with 15 or more years of service. It now pays 4 weeks per year of service, capped at 16 weeks, and only if you're terminated within 90 days of closing. It's in the 8K. Exhibit 10. 2. It is public, and it has been public since October 31st, and nobody read it, because nobody ever reads Exhibit 10.2. There are 406 people in this company with 15 or more years of service. That amendment moved somewhere around $20 million from those 406 people into the deal consideration. Some of you are standing at the back, right now, with more than 30 years in this building. Walt Kimbrough said, out loud, to nobody, well, I'll be damned. And I said, so here's my price. It has 3 parts, and it is not negotiable, and none of it is money for me. 1. Before this deal closes, this company announces a voluntary Class 1 recall of every Meridian 3 in service and a field correction to firmware 4.2.2, which, and this is in the engineering change order from November 2019, this company already wrote and already validated and already installed on every new unit and never pushed to the field because pushing it would have been a recall. 2. The July 18th amendment is rescinded retroactively, and the change of control severance plan is restored for every employee of this company. 3. Every officer who signed or approved the Complaint Coding Harmonization Initiative or the closure of COPPA 24-0117 is separated for cause, forfeiting unvested equity, and the value of that forfeited equity is placed into a settlement fund for the families of the patients in those 31 complaints. Do those 3 things, and I'll sign the consent the same afternoon, and you will never hear my name again. That's all I have. Mr. Chairman, I'd move to adjourn this meeting for 30 days so the board has time to consider it. I sat down. There was about 2 seconds of absolutely nothing. And then Dolores Haverson, 79 years old, holder of 61,000 shares of common stock and widow of the founder, stood up in the front row without a microphone and said, in a voice that filled a cafeteria, I second it. The meeting adjourned at 10:58 a.m. It had to. The chair had no choice because a merger proposal that cannot pass cannot be put to a vote, and the alternative to adjourning was holding a vote that the Inspector of Elections had already announced she would not certify. Trevor Lang said, the meeting is adjourned to a date to be determined, and stepped away from the podium, and 440 people did not move for about 10 seconds. Then somebody at the back started clapping, and it did not stop for a long time, and I sat in the second row and looked at my hands. Here's what happened in the 30 days. Day 1. Kestrel's general counsel sent a letter that afternoon stating that Kestrel considered the 3 conditions constructive and that it was prepared to support them. That was the entire ball game, and everybody knew it within 2 hours. Because the board's only remaining play would have been to litigate me into the ground and close the deal in the fall, and the buyer had just said, in writing, that it liked my terms better than theirs. Day 3. The board of directors of Havorson Medical Systems met in executive session without Trevor Lang present for the first time in 6 years. Day 5. Ford Bellamy resigned. His resignation letter was 1 paragraph and did not include the phrase "spend more time with my family," which I've always thought showed a certain dignity. Day 9. The board voted to rescind the July 18th amendment to the change of control severance plan, retroactively and in full, and to restore the 12-month benefit for every employee with 15 or more years of service. Rhonda called me from her car in a major parking lot again, and cried again, and this time so did I. Day 11. Trevor Lang was terminated for cause. For cause is the phrase that matters. For cause means every unvested share, every option, every unit gone. It means no severance. It means the company can, and did, claw back 3 years of incentive compensation under the Dodd-Frank recovery policy that the board had adopted in 2023 and that Trevor Lang himself had presented to the compensation committee. $31,200,000, forfeited by a man who told me in a hotel restaurant that 2.1 was rounding. Day 14. Lorraine Devers resigned from the board of directors of Havorson Medical Systems by email, effective immediately, without a statement. Day 19. Whitney Cole was terminated. On the same day, the Court of Common Pleas of Montgomery County granted Adele's motion for sanctions in the Ohio case, dismissed all claims against me with prejudice, and issued a written opinion whose 4th footnote observed that the affidavit supporting the trade secret allegations had been sworn on information and belief with no discernible information, and in the court's view, very little belief. Day 22. Bernie Ochoa was reinstated with full back pay and a written apology, which he framed and hung in the bay by bench 4, where it is today. Day 26, June 2nd. Havorson Medical Systems announced a voluntary class I recall of all Meridian 3 infusion pumps in the United States, Canada, and the European Union. 11,406 units. A mandatory firmware update to revision 4. 2, and a cassette door assembly replacement. A class I recall is the FDA's most serious category. The definition is a reasonable probability that use of the product will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. The press release ran 400 words and was issued at 7:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, and it did not mention my name, and I read it standing at my kitchen counter, and I had to put both hands on the counter. Day 28. The board established the Meridian Patient Settlement Fund, capitalized initially at $61,800,000, which was the value of the forfeited equity of 4 officers, and administered by an independent trustee. Day 29. Trevor Lang left me a voicemail. It came in at 11:41 on a Wednesday night from his personal cell, and I did not answer, and I have never deleted it, and I have played it exactly twice. He was not drunk. I want to be fair to him. He was tired in a way I recognized because I'd been that tired in October. He said, "Claire, it's Trevor. I know I shouldn't be calling you, and I know your lawyer's going to have a field day with this, so, you know what, fine. I wanted to say 2 things. The first is that you were right about the pump. I've read the 483. I've read the engineering change order from 2019. I didn't know about the 2019 thing. That's the truth and nobody's going to believe it, and I don't blame them, but I didn't know, and when I found out 3 weeks ago, I sat in my car in my own garage for an hour. The second thing is..." And then there's a pause of about 6 seconds. You can hear a television somewhere in his house. The second thing is that I still think I was doing the job, and that's what scares me, because I've gone back through all of it, every decision, June, July, September, and I can't find the one where I chose wrong. Every single one of them was the reasonable call with the information I had on that day. and they add up to 31 families. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not asking you to know either. Anyway, congratulations. I mean that, which is probably the worst part. Click. I played it for Adele the next morning, and she said, "Do not respond, do not acknowledge, do not delete." And I said I wasn't going to respond, and she said, "Claire, I want you to hear something." She said, "He just told you he can't find the decision where he chose wrong. He found it in June and told you it was a training problem, and he found it again in September and signed a termination memo, and he found it again in December and offered you $2.1 million to swear you didn't know." Men like that aren't lying to you at the end. They're lying to themselves the entire way through, out loud, in front of witnesses, and then they're genuinely bewildered by the arithmetic. Then she said, "That's why you win. Not because you're better, because you did the arithmetic first." Day 30, May 28th. I signed the written consent of the holder of a majority of the series, a one preferred stock at Adele Ferrero's conference table in Cincinnati at 2:40 in the afternoon. It's one page. There's one signature line. I used Gordon Haverson's pen, which Dolores gave me the week before in a paper bag with a note in it that said he'd have wanted the noise. The reconvened special meeting was held on June 16th. The merger was approved. Haverson Medical Systems became a wholly owned subsidiary of Kestrel Medical Group on July 1st at a revised price of $1,090,000,000, $310 million below the original, plus a $220 million indemnity escrow. Trevor Lang was right about one thing, and only one, and I think about it more than I want to. The delay cost $310 million. He was wrong about what it bought. 5 months later. I'm going to give you all of it, because I know that's what you're here for, and because every one of these is a public record. Trevor Lang. On September 24th, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of Ohio returned a 9-count indictment. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. 4 counts of false statements to a federal agency. 3 counts of wire fraud. 1 count of obstruction of an agency proceeding. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed a parallel civil action the same day seeking disgorgement, penalties, and an officer and director bar. He has pled not guilty. Trial is set for next fall, and I expect it to move twice. I will be there. I have already told the prosecutors I will testify, and I have already been told I probably won't need to, because Ford Bellamy will. He was removed from the board of a Children's Hospital Foundation in October. The business school that gave him a Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2022 quietly took his name off the wall of the atrium. A woman who works there told a reporter it was part of a routine refresh. He is 46 years old, and he will never run a public company again. Ford Bellamy pled guilty on August 19th to 1 count of making a false statement to a federal agency. He is cooperating. His sentencing is in March, and the government has filed a motion recognizing substantial assistance. The SEC barred him from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. The Accountancy Board of Ohio suspended his CPA license in September. He is 52. His lawyer said at the plea hearing that he had made a decision in 11 minutes that he has thought about every day since, and I believe that, and it does not move me as much as I once thought it would. Whitney Cole. No charges. She didn't know about the pump. I'm confident of that. What she did was execute a termination she knew was retaliatory and then swear an affidavit she had no basis for because a lawyer told her the words to use. The sanctions opinion is public, and it names her, and it is the first thing that comes up when you search her. She started an HR consulting practice in July. Her website says she specializes in compassionate workforce transitions. I want to say something here that I've thought about a lot. Whitney Cole never gained $1 from the pump. She gained $4.2 million from a deal, and she read a script to a woman in a chemotherapy ward, and she genuinely believed she was being kind by keeping her voice warm. There are more Whitney Coles in the world than there are Trevor Langs, and I'm not sure which does more damage over a lifetime. Lorraine DeVers. She was named in a stockholder derivative action in Delaware alleging breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the July 18th plan amendment. It survived a motion to dismiss in November, which is the part that costs you. She resigned from 3 other boards over the summer. In October, the Arts Foundation, where she had chaired the gala for 11 years, announced its new leadership, and her name was not in the release. She sent me a note in August, handwritten on the same cream stationery as the note she sent me in 2011. It said, "Claire, I was wrong about which bad thing was worse. I'm not asking you to write back. L. I have not written back. I might. The families. The Meridian Patient Settlement Fund made its first distributions in October. 31 families. Individual awards are confidential, and I don't know them and I don't want to." Doreen Whatley called me on October 9th. She talked for a while about the paperwork, which was hard, and about her brother, who is difficult. Then she said, "They sent a letter with it. It says the device may have contributed." She said, "That's all I wanted. I didn't want money. I wanted a piece of paper that says my mother didn't just die." Bernie Ochoa. Kestrel's quality organization created a new role for him in August, principal engineer, field failure analysis. He reports to Dr. Anik Ball. He hit 35 years in November and his pension multiplier stepped up, and he is retiring in 2 years and 4 months, and he has a countdown taped to his toolbox, and he has told me the number every single time we have spoken since March. He still keeps the notebook. Kestrel's lawyers asked him to stop. Dr. Ball told them to leave him alone. Sunny Reyes. She was promoted in September. She now runs complaint intake for Kestrel's entire infusion division, 140 people across 3 sites. She is 35 years old. She wrote the new classification procedure herself. There's a line in it in Section 4.2 that says, "Where a narrative is ambiguous, the complaint shall be routed to investigation. Ambiguity is not a basis for closure." She emailed it to me before she published it. Subject line, "Is this how you'd write it?" I wrote back one word. Me. The Ohio case was dismissed with prejudice and sanctioned. The Delaware declaratory judgment action was dismissed by stipulation on June 1st. My counterclaims, FMLA retaliation, wrongful discharge in violation of public policy, and breach of the retention award, settled on July 22nd for $4,100,000 plus fees. I took it. I want to be honest about that. I stood in a cafeteria in April and said none of it was money for me, and that was true about the consent, and then I settled my own claims 2 months later for $4 million, and both of those things are true, and I don't apologize for either one. Marcus's medical bills came to $211,000 after insurance. Iris's loans are gone. There's a trust now, which I never thought I'd say. Kestrel offered me the VP of Quality role for the whole infusion division in August. Bigger job than I ever had. I said no. I teach 2 days a week at Wright State now, regulatory affairs, to graduate students, most of whom are working adults. I do expert work for plaintiffs' firms on device cases, which pays extremely well and which I limit to 4 a year because it's corrosive. And I sit on the advisory board of the Settlement Trust, unpaid, which is the only title on my email signature. Marcus, he went back to the podium in October. I sat in the 4th row of a middle school gymnasium on a Thursday night and watched my husband, who weighs 161 pounds now and eats 6 small meals a day, and will for the rest of his life, lift both arms in front of 61 7th graders playing a concert march badly. His most recent scan was clean. There's a room in that building now, on the 2nd floor, that used to be Conference Room 2B. Kestrel renamed it in September, and the plaque by the door says the Ochoa Room, and Bernie has said publicly that it's ridiculous and has privately walked past it, according to Charlotte Dees, at least 400 times. I've only been back once. Dr. Ball asked me to come speak to the quality staff in November, and I said yes, and I stood in front of 80 people, about 30 of whom I had hired, and I did not talk about any of this. I talked about audit trails. I talked about the fact that in 2016 I made a design decision that everybody hated, to make the quality systems audit log immutable, non-configurable, and impossible for an administrator to purge, which added 4 months and $110,000 to the implementation, and which 3 executives asked me to reverse. And I told them that 9 years later, an 11-minute gap in that log was the single piece of evidence that made everything else undeniable. I said, build the thing that will testify against you, especially when you're the one who'd be testified against, especially then. Afterward, a young woman waited until the room cleared and said, Mrs. Whitfield, can I ask, how did you know to keep the certificate? And I told her the truth, which is that I didn't. A 70-year-old man slid a folder across my desk in 2004 and told me to hang on to my copy, and I put it in a file, and my file went into his basement in 2011 when we cleaned out the old office, and it sat on a steel shelf in a banker's box for 14 years, and I found it because a widow let me down the stairs. I did not keep that certificate because I was wise. I kept it because somebody I trusted told me to, and because I am the kind of person who does not throw paper away. Let me say something to you directly before I let you go. If you are the person in your organization who holds the file, the one who knows where everything is, who does the work nobody thanks you for, who is described in your performance review as a solid contributor, I want you to hear the actual lesson of this, and it is not find a certificate of designation in a basement. It's this. People like Trevor Lang do not win because they are smarter than you. They win because they are certain, and because they move fast, and because they have learned that a competent, conscientious person can be made to feel that raising a problem is a failure of teamwork. They don't overrule you. They reframe you. They make the question about your timing, your tone, your understanding of the bigger picture, anything except whether the thing you said is true. And when that stops working, they don't argue with you. They remove you. Quickly, warmly, with a script, at the worst possible moment in your life, because the worst possible moment is when you are least able to fight. So here is what I know now that I did not know on September 12th. Write things down on your own time, on your own paper, like Bernie Ochoa. Keep your copies. Read the documents nobody reads, the exhibit, the footnote, the 21-year-old filing. And when they finally come for you, do not take one single thing that isn't yours, because your empty hands will be worth more than any file you could have stolen. And understand this, because it is the whole thing. They are not afraid of your anger. They budget for your anger. They are afraid of your records. You do not have to be louder than them. You have to be the one who kept the paper. If any part of this landed on something in your own working life, tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I promise you are not the only person who has ever been walked out of a building they built. And if you want more stories about ordinary people who were underestimated exactly once, hit like and subscribe to Revenge Lab. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the people telling these stories. On the 12th of September, 2 men came to my door and took a laptop, and it never once occurred to anyone to ask what else I still had. Gordon Havorson slid a folder across my desk in October of 2004 and said 7 words I mistook for sentiment. Don't ever let them take that paper back. I didn't.